Okay, hi guys. One more time, last time on Plato. And for this final lecture on Plato, I want to return to the topic of mimesis, with which we began our look at Republic Book 10. Mimesis, you guys will recall, I hope, is the Greek term, but one that we can very usefully learn and use, the Greek term for imitation or representation, imitation and or representation, the whole way in which art or literature or any other creative activity, so art in the broadest sense, the whole way in which it has the capacity to kind of take a picture of or make a copy of the world. So mimesis is when we are describing or depicting the world in whatever medium, whatever artistic stuff, in other words, or using whatever artistic technique. So poetry can be mimetic, obviously, in various ways. Stories are mimetic, plays, movies, and so on. Gesture is mimetic. Even music can be mimetic, sort of. And perhaps it could be an interesting discussion as to whether there are forms of art that actually can't be mimetic. Food, maybe. Can cuisine be mimetic? I'm not sure. And a full discussion of that would take us into the territory of semiotics, where we will actually be in a couple of weeks. But for now, we just want to try to deal more fully and finally with Plato's discussion of mimesis in Republic 10, not because it is, tremendously coherent or correct, or because it solves any problems, but rather because it tends to create some really, really interesting problems and is, in fact, a very, very problematic and slippery concept and discussion. So that's what I want to do. As we have seen, Plato-Socrates takes a very dim view of art or literature as mimetic. As we have seen previously, Socrates makes this argument that mimetic art, art that represents the world, makes a copy or takes a picture of the world, is in a very profound and problematic way taking us away from reality. So for Plato, Socrates, the farther we get into the art world, as it were, the farther away from the real we find ourselves. I want to make it very clear that I am absolutely not selling or arguing for this idea. Quite the contrary. All we're trying to do is sketch this Platonic theory and critique of mimesis as a very, very important and influential one in the history of thinking about literature and art. For our purposes, it functions as a very, very important idea in the history of what we're calling literary criticism. And as I was saying in a previous lecture, and it's worth pausing over this, I think, one more time, it's not just Plato who has, in the history of what we vaguely call Western culture at least, it's not just Plato who has some nasty things to say about art and about mimetic or representational art. In particular, I added just today to the Canvas page a little bit of the Old Testament, Exodus 20, and really we just need to read, or you just need to read Exodus 20, the first 4 verses to get the point. It's the second commandment, against graven images. God himself in the Old Testament speaks from Mount Sinai, basically saying, don't make pictures of anything. So in that biblical tradition, there are powerfully mixed feelings, let's say, about mimesis. And as you guys know, I'm sure, that commandment against making graven images or pictures, that commandment against mimesis is then taken up very, very seriously in Islam, such that in Islamic art actually is not mimetic art. When you visit a mosque, you don't see pictures, you see rather an art that is based on Arabic calligraphy. So we can make, I think, a couple of really big, but I think not bogus generalizations. The first one would be, look, all cultures have art and literature. There is no culture without art or literature. And art essentially tends to be mimetic. There can, of course, be abstract art and various things, and as I've just been suggesting, maybe there are art forms that aren't really normally mimetic, but very typically, if we're talking about visual art, written art, theatrical art, dance, even musical art to some extent, very typically we're talking about a mimetic phenomenon, and certainly when we think of visual art, which, as you know, is Plato's exemplar for exactly this reason. Certainly, if we think of visual art, making pictures, we think of something that is quintessentially mimetic. All cultures then have mimesis, they have representational art, and yet many cultures have found and generated reasons to be anti-art, or at least to have mixed feelings about the representation of the world. In art or literature, art perhaps is not serious. We've got better things to do than sit around talking about poetry. At least that's how some people think about it. Art is not real. It's not building you a house or frying you an egg or managing your stock portfolio. There are more. There's a real world to be dealt with, which art does not give us. Art is deceptive. After all, it's a little bit crazy if you think about your relationship to the artwork too much. You go to an art museum, for example, spend hours slowly walking through the museum, looking at these squares of canvas or whatever covered in pigment. I mean, what are you even doing? It's deceptive, and yet by the same token, or at the same time, art and literature are extremely captivating. As I think I said in the first lecture on Plato's Republic, you know, he's here, this text is here on our course because it's bringing us back in a very powerful and hard-hitting way to the fundamental question that informs our inquiry, which is, what is it good for? It meaning art and literature. Now, Plato's Socrates, as we have been discussing, basically gives a very round and very negative answer to that question. What is mimesis good for? Plato Socrates says almost absolutely nothing. He makes a couple of small exceptions, but they don't, I think, really matter very much. I do want to argue, and I want to make explicit that I have been arguing this, that I think Socrates' argument in Republic, Book 10, really can't stand. It isn't sustainable, and rather it's an argument against which we have a lot of opportunity and right, let's say, to push back. As I've been saying, there's kind of three aspects of Socrates' anti-art, anti-literature argument. There's a metaphysical aspect, there's a moral aspect, and there's a third aspect that I have awkwardly been calling the subject matter aspect. I've been pushing back in previous lectures against those last two, against the moral argument and the subject matter argument. In this final lecture on Plato, I want to push back against the metaphysical argument against mimesis. And what I'm going to argue for the next little while is that that aspect of Socrates' argument is unstable, it's paradoxical, it's self-canceling, and really I think it collapses, and I certainly think it is meant to collapse. Along the lines of that ironic distance between Plato and Socrates that I was talking about in the last lecture. So, pushing back against Socrates' metaphysical critique of mimesis, and when I say the metaphysical critique, I mean this whole business of mimesis art taking us farther and farther away from reality. First and most obviously, and I think most easily, the critique itself that we're getting from Plato, the critique itself is mimetic. We're reading a dialogue when we're reading Republic, Book 10. That is to say, we are reading a record in words, a record in writing of a dialogue that supposedly historically took place between Socrates, Glaucon, Adeimantus, and others. If that dialogue did historically take place, if it's sort of non-fiction, in other words, then it's precisely and only through Plato's representation of that dialogue in words that we have any access to it. It's only through mimesis that we get access to this dialogue that we're reading about between Socrates and his friends. As we have discussed previously in our long now look at Plato, Plato's Socrates seems to have been completely committed to the oral scenario of philosophy, friends talking together with nothing left over at the end, no record, no text, nothing to kind of hand down. Plato moves Socrates into writing, and that means that he operates mimetically on Socrates' philosophy. We're not sitting down with Socrates, of course not, when we're reading Republic 10. We're sitting down with a representation of Socrates, a mimetic effect through Plato's writing. On the other hand, we may suppose, and reasonably suppose, that this dialogue never really took place. It's something Plato kind of made up based on what he knows about Socrates and Socrates' philosophy and based on what Plato wants to say. In that case, then actually it is only in Plato's mimesis that we even have a Republic dialogue, that we even have any of these ideas, these Socratic ideas that Plato wants to get across to us. Socrates claims that mimesis takes us away from reality, takes us away from understanding the true nature of the world. We only even have access to that claim through a mimetic representation, namely Republic, Book 10. The critique of mimesis occurs through and is an instance of mimesis. And in that way, I think, the critique clearly kind of cancels itself out. Second, and I'm going to try to articulate 3 pushbacks against Socrates' argument. And I confess they are going to get kind of harder to articulate as we go through. So the second, and I think more difficult, and by that token more interesting pushback that we can give is going to work something like this. It's going to have to do with the role of mimesis, I mean the concept, the category, the phenomenon of mimesis in Socrates' fundamental thinking about the world. And when I say that, I mean his fundamental thinking about what basically, and in the last analysis, exists and is real, okay? And how we can have some kind of encounter with or knowledge of what is real. So, where's reality according to Plato's Socrates? Well, you'll recall, and the point by now is has been completely kind of pummeled into the ground. We've made the point so many times. You'll recall that Socrates objects to art because it's making a copy of a copy. The table itself is only a copy of the idea of the table. The idea is made by God. The carpenter makes a wooden table. A painter then can paint a picture of the wooden table. The art is a copy of a copy. It is the artwork, that is to say a painting, for example, a painting of a table, or Vincent's painting of his bed. A painting of a table is a mimesis of a mimesis, okay? But that, of course, means, and the point, I think, is not one that Plato's Socrates makes explicit, and yet it's a point that I think is completely and necessarily available in the argument that Plato's Socrates makes. If the painting of a table is a copy of a copy, is a mimesis of a mimesis, then what that means, obviously, is that the wooden table is a mimesis. The wooden table is already an artistic work. It's already a representation or imitation of an original, in this case, the idea of the table. The world itself, I mean the world that we live in, that surrounds us, that we take to be real, and which has to be our starting place for trying to understand the real. The world itself, for Plato's Socrates, is actually an art world. We are living in a painting, according to Plato's Socrates, if you like, or maybe a more contemporary and more kind of portable version of that claim or that way of thinking about it. We're living in a movie, according to Plato's Socrates. And if it sometimes seems kind of not wholly real, well, that's because it isn't. That's what our lived existence actually is, not moving around in fundamental reality, but rather moving around in a representation of reality, a simulation, if you like. And maybe in tutorial we can talk about the the kinds of ideas that you get from some science fiction quarters about the world being a simulation that we are living in. Anyway, that is actually a kind of Platonic idea. The world that we take to be real is not really real. It is rather a mimetic or artistic representation of what is real. And now there's two sub-points that I want to make here, and which I think are takeaways from this aspect of our critique of Plato. The first has to do with this very category of art, or mimesis. If the world is just a big painting, if the way we understand the nature of the world has to be that it's just like a big movie, if we live in the category of art, actually, in the category of mimesis, then I don't think we can claim or allow or accept Socrates' claim that mimesis is something that takes us away from the nature of reality. I think it's the other way around. Mimesis, the category of mimesis, the phenomenon of mimesis, is precisely and uniquely how we can gain access, or at least start to gain access, to the nature of reality. According to Plato's Socrates, reality, what we take to be reality, is art. It is mimetic. I think it actually follows that if we want to think about reality, we are bloody well going to have to think about mimesis. That category is actually going to be our vector into trying to understand the nature of reality, rather than being our vector away from that kind of inquiry. And the second subpoint comes back to a question that I believe I asked at the end of our last tutorial. Plato's Socrates, of course, assigns, so to speak, real reality, the area of the ideas or forms, or the level of the ideas or forms. He assigns that to the dominion and the authority of a supreme being, an abstract and universal divinity, God. In this picture that Socrates gives us, then, who is God? What kind of figure is God according to Socrates' vision? How can we begin to grasp the nature of the divine and the nature of the divine function in this series of representational makings that Plato talks about? Well, I think the answer to that is very clear. God in Socrates' vision is nothing other than an artist. He is the first maker. He's making the originals, the ideas that get copied. But for all that, God makes those ideas just as the carpenter makes the first copy and the painter makes the second copy. And it's really interesting. It's a very, very difficult bit of the philosophical back and forth in Republic 10, but it's really interesting and important that Socrates actually has to get a little bit worried about, whether there's an idea behind God's idea. When God makes an idea, is there an original to that idea? No. God makes the idea originally. Nonetheless, and the simpler point is the one that I want to stick to. In Socrates' vision, if we ask what kind of being God is nothing other than an artist. And by that token again, on Socrates' own argument, the category of art and the function of the artist, far from taking us away from an inquiry into fundamental reality, it actually takes us toward and into that kind of inquiry into fundamental reality. And I mean, it works that way precisely if we do accept some version of Socrates' argument. A couple of weeks ago, when we were still looking at the ion, we had a discussion about the concept of furor or furor, that divine madness, which Socrates is prepared to accept the rhapsode is good at getting into. That's kind of his métier or his skill. So I was suggesting that if we look at the whole history of thinking about artists as kind of crazy inspired people, remarkably, that actually turns out to be an idea with a Platonic history. It is the flip side, so to speak, of the philosophical coin that Socrates wants to make current, that coin of rigorous, rational knowledge. The crazy artist thing is actually the other side of that, and is again a Platonic legacy. Right now, what I want to point out is that we can adduce a similarly Platonic heritage for the very powerful and long-standing tradition of the artist as quasi-divine, as existing, especially if she or he is a very great artist, existing at some kind of higher level of being. So the way people talk about Michelangelo in the 16th century, il divo Michelangelo, the divine Michelangelo, the way people talk about Mozart, Beethoven, our friend Kanye West, the quasi or semi-divine status that has often been ascribed to the artistic function or artistic vocation in the history of Western culture, at least, that is one that we can tie back to the Platonic heritage. And again, in this case, because art, as I have just been arguing, art creativity, making things that will become things and pictures, that's God's activity. He is the original maker, the original artist. And the third point, and I think the most difficult one, the third area of this kind of pushback against Plato's argument, and by the way, nothing I'm saying here is kind of from the burning bush, to borrow a metaphor from Exodus. These points that I'm making are very much points in argument, and they are all open and available for discussion in tutorial, in your own written work, etc. So the third pushback that I want to try to offer, and this one's really difficult to articulate, I think, it has to do with trying to kind of look again or consider all over again what actually is meant by mimesis. This idea that Socrates presents as easy to understand, in a sense, as stable and intelligible, the idea of mimesis. What if the very idea of mimesis, what if that idea is actually not that stable or that intelligible at all, but is instead really quite slippery and really quite strange? Socrates partly takes for granted and partly insists that there has to be a barrier, a kind of absolute obvious barrier between what is a representation in art or any mimesis, between what is a representation and what gets represented. So, between the painting of the bed, that's a mimesis, that's a representation. And on the other hand, the bed, that's what gets represented. And for Socrates, the bed is totally non-mimetic, even though it's a copy of the ideal bed made by God. So there has to be an absolute barrier for Socrates between mimesis itself and what is reflected or captured in the mimesis. There has to be an absolute barrier between the mirror, which is, of course, a metaphor that Socrates uses early on in his discussion in Republic Book 10. There has to be an absolute barrier, absolute categorical distinction between the mirror and the world, which is reflected in the mirror. And I want to wrap up this final lecture on Plato with some suggestions that it may not be nearly as simple as that. And I guess I want to focus these suggestions actually in ancient Greek culture in the first instance. And there's several issues here which will give us, I think, some very tasty stuff to talk about in tutorial that this week. We can first of all, we can draw a little circle, metaphorically speaking, around the role of that mirror in Socrates' discussion. We nowadays, in 21st century Canada, we take mirrors very much for granted. And I'm not talking abstractly or philosophically here at all, you guys. I'm talking about that kind of object, a piece of polished glass, which we go by at IKEA or whatever, and that we use to see ourselves, that we use for the purposes of a very clear, very kind of decisive and crisp mimesis. But, and this I think becomes really potentially interesting, mirrors like that, they're actually a very, very recent technological development in the history of the world. I would think not really or widely available, that kind of polished glass mirror with a steel or other backing. I think that kind of object probably would not be reliably available, or prior, certainly not prior to the 19th century. Excuse me, I think 18th century is what I meant to say. There are devices going back to ancient times that are used for mirrors, but they're not nearly as effective or as clear as that. Even if we go back to the Renaissance, if we go back to the poetry of John Donne and of Shakespeare, for example, both of them have a bunch of poems, as some of you may know, where they kind of riff on the idea of a mirror, which for them is actually the same as glass. So we're actually talking about, in a kind of tangent, but not entirely a tangent, we're talking about the history of glass production. And for Shakespeare and Donne in the early 17th century, for Shakespeare and Donne, when you look at a window, for example, you may be able to look through it, or it may reflect your reflection back to you. And this is because the glass is very thick and very impure from our point of view. So what I'm trying to say in a rather turgid way is it's only very, very recently in the history of the world that we have had objects really that have that very clear and well-defined mirroring function. A mirror that reflects you back to you so crisply and decisively. So when Socrates, early in the Republic, when he tells Glaucon that he can become the greatest artist ever just by picking up a mirror and turning it around the world, well, we are, I think, empowered to ask, what kind of mirror is that? What the heck are you even talking about? I think it is not clear at all, and we'll come back to this in tutorial this week. It's not at all clear that Socrates or Socrates' contemporaries would have access at all to the kind of mirror that he seems to be talking about. So that's a critique then, a pushback that has to do with things that are mimetic in the ancient Greek world. And I'm suggesting that the barrier between what is and is not mimetic is not nearly as clear or as well defined in the ancient Greek world as Socrates wants to insist. And now I want to go on and make basically the same point with regard to things that are not mimetic. I mean objects in the ancient Greek world. Beds and tables and chariots and swords and vases and so on. All those things that Socrates thinks it is worthwhile going to learn about. You just shouldn't waste your time looking at mimetic representations of those things. So there's this, again, Socrates partly assumes, partly insists upon this very strong distinction between the non-mimetic, ordinary objects in the world, and the mimetic, artistic objects. Real things, if I can put it this way, in Socrates' view, kind of exist outside the artistic economy, the economy of mimetic representation. And again, this, I think, from a material culture point of view, so to speak, this is a very kind of questionable assumption or insistence that Socrates makes, and that is because in the ancient world, almost nothing, no objects, I mean, are outside the artistic economy, by which, so that's kind of a fancy phrase, I simply mean almost everything in the ancient Greek world is touched by mimesis, covered in mimesis. Everything is artistic. Everything is decorated. And this is, I think, a very fascinating topic in the history, the very, very broad and deep history of art and culture. But certainly in the ancient Greek world and in many, many other areas of the ancient or even just pre-modern world, when you get an object or make an object, whether it's a vase or a bed or a chest of drawers or a shield, when you get a use object like that, that object is always decorated. It is covered in pictures, covered in representations of the world, covered in mimesis. So Socrates wants there to be a very strong and clear distinction between just plain looking at the world, on the one hand, and looking at pictures of the world, on the other hand. The point I'm trying to make right now is that in ancient times, in Socrates' own society, looking at the world is looking at pictures of the world. Because that world of the ancient Greeks, that world of vases and chariots and swords and chests of drawers and beds and shields, that world is totally decorated. All of those objects covered in pictures, in instances of mimesis that look back at you when you look at them. And again, at this point, as we begin to move away from our look at Plato, I am not trying or claiming for 1 second to be kind of putting issues to bed, so to speak, in our look at Plato. Quite the contrary. It's more like we're opening Pandora's box in our look at Plato at this point and moving on from important concepts in Plato's discussion to important problems in Plato's discussion, and this very paradoxical, circular, maddening relationship between what is and is not supposedly mimetic, between the real world and representations of the real world. This distinction and relation starts to become actually very, very difficult to keep track of, very difficult to make sense of, especially, I'm arguing, in the ancient Greek context itself. And I just want to wind that point up and wind this lecture up by directing your attention a bit toward the object which is described in the Homeric text that I added as a kind of secondary text to our syllabus for this part of our course. That's the shield of Achilles. Now, I'm not going to repeat my Homeric recitation thing because we are already working hard enough, let's say. But that episode from the Iliad, it's a very, very famous one in which, as some of you guys will know, Achilles loses his armor. His best friend Patroclus goes to fight in Achilles' armor, and he's killed on the battlefield, and the Trojans take his armor, which is what you do in the ancient Greek heroic and military world. Achilles loses his armor. So he goes to his mom, who happens to be a goddess, the sea goddess Thetis, and says, "Mom, I lost my armor. I need new armor." She says, "No problem, sonny." And she goes off to Hephaestus, the armorer god of the Greeks, and Hephaestus makes Achilles a new suit of armor. And Homer begins that section with this incredible long discussion of Achilles' shield. If you haven't read it yet, I would urge you to read it, if only because it's incredibly awesome. we get a description of Achilles' shield that goes on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines. And what does Homer talk about in that long description? About what does he say about Achilles' shield, this essential element of ancient Greek warcraft that Achilles is going to carry before him in battle in order to ward off sword strokes and spear strokes? What does Homer say? Does he say, well, Hephaestus, used triple ply plutonium, and behind that there was a kind of sub-shield of impenetrable adamant, and it was, it was hardened in the fire 15 times. No, that's not what Homer talks about at all. When he describes Achilles' shield, he describes what's on the shield, the pictures that Hephaestus embosses on the outside of that shield. The outside, mind you, that's very important. That's the side of the shield that is directed toward Achilles' enemies. That's what he's showing the Trojan army when he walks back out to battle with that new shield that Hephaestus has made for him. If you go back and read that incredible bit of Homer, what you'll find, and what I think we can generalize, or what I think we can say by way of summarizing what Hephaestus puts on that shield. Basically, he puts the Homeric world on that shield. Now, the shield, as an object, in the first instance, what is it? It's a disc of burnished metal. In effect, the shield is a mirror. And when Achilles carries that disc of burnished metal around, he's reflecting the world in that shield. The thing is, and this again is a difficult thought to articulate and a difficult thought to hold in your head and a difficult thought to make sense of, to know what to make of. The thing is, Achilles' shield already has the Homeric world on it, right? So it's not just that the mirror reflects the world when Achilles carries that shield around. It's also the case that the world reflects the mirror, because the shield already shows that Homeric world. So to wrap up, what we have in the Platonic concept of mimesis is a problem, a very paradoxical, slippery, and I think fascinating and profound problem in search of a solution. Socrates wants to lay down a very clear and categorical distinction between what is and is not art. For my money, the function of that distinction in Plato is to break down and leave us with that very question about what is and is not art. What is the relationship between the world that is reflected in art and literature and the art and literature that reflects the world? Which makes which? Or do they both make and affect each other? And if so, in what ways? And what might be the consequences of that very kind of slippery and difficult idea? Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. Once again, I will ask, if you have time, please have a look at that Homeric excerpt and the little bit of Exodus that I added to the Canvas page, excuse me. That wraps up everything I'm going to say about Plato. We will talk about him, I'm sure, again in tutorial this week. The next lecture that I give, though, will be on our next reading, which is our selection from Aristotle's Poetics. Okay, thank you guys, as always, for watching.